Good evening, friends. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Akeel Bilgrami and Mr. Ashok Vajpayee for this invitation. I found the lectures which we received ahead very, very instructive and educative, particularly because it spoke to the questions that I've been grappling with in my work at the intersection of law and sociology, and not quite been able to crack. And somehow, reading the first lecture, which I received quite a while ago, alongside Akeel's recent book on capital culture and the commons, seemed to open up possibilities and ideas that I could productively explore in terms of the ways in which we understand the law and the Constitution working on the ground. And then I was really pleasantly surprised to receive the second lecture, which is actually very closely connected to the book. So it seemed like the interstices had been illuminated in a manner of speaking. I can't, of course, I mean, there are several points in both the lectures, although I was meant to comment on one. I find them both very connected. There are too many points in both that I could explore, but I picked about 5 or 6, and I will just go over them quickly. But I must say that these are actually the thoughts that got triggered for me while I was reading the lectures. And so it's like, in a sense, my response that may not be directly connected to or taking the points that the arguments that Akeel makes in his lecture, but to see where that takes me in terms of my work. The first point that I looked at was on the reach of truth and obstacles that have been placed in its path. In probing this, I reached back to the book, Capital, Culture, and the Commons, and found that it helped me better understand what is evidently, apologies for the legalese, evidently a conceptual blank. And I reached back to this work because the first lecture, like I said, leads in that direction, and the second draws quite substantively from the concerns in the book and takes it forward. At a more basic level, though, the book helps me reflect on both the lectures better. The context I embed my comment in is the commons, what Nityanand Jayaraman, for instance, speaks of as Porambokku in Tamil, spoken of at the moment of its diminishment, as Akeel alerts us, and its weaponized enclosure. We may think of the habitations of truth, the paths to reach which are in fact obstructed by moral, political, and aesthetic judgments about human behavior and society that construct a narrow politics that channel our journey, putting truth out of reach and making reaching impossible through the thickets of reasoning and making its reach stop there, which are questions that Akeel reflects on in quite great detail. As someone who is ever preoccupied with the everydayness of the Constitution, not its spectacular moments, which are also in a sense part of its everydayness and continuous and contiguous with it, the problems that beset reaching truth and the reach of truth are striking. I tend to think of this in terms of cases and judgments, or judgments that ought to have been, absent judgments, shall we say. These are the everyday ones, and the recent acquittal of the accused in a case of lynching, the continuing incarcerations of political dissenters, and their entrapment in the talons of opaque anti-terror laws, the truths in prison diaries of dissenters, are truths that circulate within prisons. Procedure, juridical for instance, remains impervious to truth-telling in deeply agonizing ways. The diaries tell us about what we know, but keep locked up about the ordinariness of carcerality, and carcerality is another trope that Akeel explores, the ordinariness of carcerality in our judgments about people and society, but also in the very act of telling the dissenters who are incarcerated are harking to ways in which this ordinariness does not draw from the background that we know of a collectivity as a collectivity that gave to themselves a constitution. The specific point I begin with is the relationship, therefore, between the background or the non-discursive and the implicit, and the foreground or the discursive and the explicit. If we treat the Constitution as a commons, a shared commons that bind a group as a group in its own self-conception, and I'm quoting him, then what are the ways in which the non-explicit, non-discursive traditions of fellowship speak to the discursive formations in the foreground? In invoking the commons, we are speaking of its philosophical genealogies and its fundamental premises, grounded in the complex interplay of sharing, sustenance, and I would add fellowship, that remain for the most part inarticulate and unself-conscious in the lived contexts of the everyday. Unself-conscious because they are non-explicit and non-discursive. Ideally, the foreground should draw from and express the spirit of the background, of the Constitution as commons. And we do not really register, as Akeel alerts us, we do not register the ideal as long as it is working. Why are we distressed today by judicial pronouncements that erect weaponized enclosures around what we understand and know as the commons? The fact of that collective gasp of disbelief and dismay harks perhaps to the reach of truth that is embedded in the idea of what I like to believe is the Constitution as a commons. The second point that I look at is on the relations that truth bears to freedom or self-rule and autonomy. This is brought to the fore quite literally at the end of the point I just made. Is incarceration a metaphor for the fencing in of truth? We may take this further, as Akeel suggests, and I quote, to see Swaraj as synonymous with autonomy and conjoin the notion of freedom with self-rule. He argues that it is precisely this conjunction that makes an entire dominant liberal tradition of the political enlightenment anxious, unquote. But we witness this anxiety and moral panic in real time as Swaraj conjoined with Azadi, which is the word for Swaraj that we have heard ring through cities in this country since 2019, in the context of the citizenship question and political dissent, drives a fierce carcerality to hold truth in captivity. I'm reminded here of the question, for instance, that Mr. Habibullah asked yesterday about the Western Indian distinctions, about the Western, non-Western distinctions in argumentation, of which a little more later. And then the relationship between Swaraj and Satya. which is yet another point that Akeel elaborates on. We can gain independence from a colonial master and still be enslaved, both cognitively and in one's cultural and social life. We find different iterations of this in the oceanic works of anti-caste philosophers and in the voices of women who challenge the thraldom of caste and patriarchal oppression and violence. Ratmabai and Tarabai Shinde come to mind immediately for me, and they bring in the element of freedom and the domestic, the deep truths of servitude and unfreedom. I'm also struck by the possibility of connecting Swaraj and Satya to Dukkha. Ankit Kavade's short, compelling piece on Mukta Salve and her use of Dukkha, which excavates the truth of suffering as distinct and separate from grief, as a deep, searing longing for Swaraj that emerges from the emancipatory anti-caste intellectual traditions is important. My point is that Swaraj is a many-splendored pursuit of truth. The truth itself reaches out in so many different ways to conjoin with the idea of freedom and self-rule, breaking free from our nature cultures. We're talking about the commons. To ask, after Akeel, does one have reason to do what one's inclinations would have them do? Ought we to acquiesce to our inclination and continue to live in the blissful, opiate lull of heteronomy? The autonomy reflecting question that is ever present, as Akeel suggests, whether asked or not, by virtue of our capacity to ask it, more specifically to address ourselves not just to any norm, but the moral norm or the goodwill or a universal norm. And the emphasis on reason and the ought is not so much on individual self-interest as it is on the group and the individual situated in the group. And this really bears reiteration. Akeel says it is the truth that sets us free. And if we get things wrong, we lack autonomy, despite having chosen and authorized what we did. How would one apply this to the reasoning of courts in particular cases? Take the case of Sharjeel Imam and Omar Khaled. The courtly decisions here force us to raise the question of the relationship between autonomy, truth, and azadi, between satya and dukkha, which at this point signals both suffering and grief at the caging or enclosure of the truth. Where it remains free is in the Constitution as commons that must then reinvent the foreground. And I will come back to that at the end, on transparency, opacity, and the veridical perception of the truth. If there is no other way in which the truth can be disclosed, and I'm quoting, no transcendent path to it, the conceptual default must be transparency. When there is opacity in some cases, then explanation is called for, and a warning that we should be more alert and vigilant and reflectively vigilant than we have been, unquote. The importance of veridical perception is brought home to us, for instance, through the opacity of carceral judgments, where the positing of conjectural likeness creates a dissonance in the perception of truth, utterly lacking as it does in transparency. This is, of course, to oversimplify the case Akeel is making, but the comparison struck me as stark. For it is, after all, transparency that we claim in interpreting rights under the Constitution, particularly the right to personal liberty in the present time. And personal liberty here acquires layers of meaning in the course of our subcontinental and vernacular engagements. To what conceptualization of law in the background must be hawk to enable a renewal of its implementation in the foreground. Where the foreground cancels the basic precepts that structure the background, how might one recover a different enunciation of the foreground that the background enables? It is a basic question of citizenship and survival, and the affirmation of dignity. 2 days ago, I was at the Rohit Vemula Shahadat Din gathering, marking 10 years of his passing, in the University of Hyderabad, with 2 mothers and 1 father, deeply grieving the loss of their children to the violence of caste in institutions of higher education, stood and spoke to a gathering of largely Dalit students on the need to stand their ground to defeat caste, to never give up. It is a scene etched in my mind. 2 questions occurred to me. What is the place of emancipation? All over again. What is the place of emancipation in the argument that freedom or Swaraj is underwritten by dignity, which is the deep longing that dukkha laments? How does one perceive the frame of anti-caste in the background and articulate it in the foreground, both all the way from the cultural commons that Akeel speaks of to the more specific constitutionalist commons? Might this be an illustration of his observation that truth is truth, not local truth, not truth related to a practice, even if we can only apprehend the truth because of the background of our own practices, forms of life, unquote. And of course, it also leads us back to Mr. Habibullah's question yesterday. In thinking through the idea of the constitutionalist commons and working around the ways in which we might delineate the frames, which is a term that Akeel uses in the last part of his book, delineate the frames and the conversations and the relationality between frames and between the implicit and the explicit that he opens out. There are so many pathways to understanding this in all its complexity and its utter simplicity. In that book and in a previous one as well, Akeel tells a father's story that I have read many times over and really liked. I have a father's story and was wondering how it might be illuminated by or might illuminate Akeel's story of his beach walk with his father. The idea, his father's story, the idea that nobody will pick up a wallet full of money lying on the beach if we don't pick it up, as pointing to a belief in a fellowship of human beings who breathe this air of truth. My father's reply to a judge in the 1970s who wanted to know why he was seeking constitutional protection for people who did not believe in the Constitution, in this case the Naxalites, the radical left, that boycotted bourgeois courts in the early 70s. The judge asks, why should Naxalites who do not believe in the Constitution take shelter under it? My father says, I replied, when such issues come before the court, it is your values and not their values that are on trial. It is the values enshrined in the Constitution that are under test. The your and their, it struck me, seemed to reflect not the codified Constitution, but the non-discursive Constitution as originary values, perhaps, that my father was alluding to. This thought, I have read this story many, many times, and I have heard him recount this story to me even more number of times. But this possibility never occurred to me. This thought occurred to me quite unexpectedly, that there is perhaps in his grappling with the Constitution, the idea of a non-discursive, originary framework of the Constitution as commons that then results in the foreground of codified, implementable, justiciable rights. In conclusion, in these lectures and in his work on the commons, Akeel presents profound possibilities. How, for instance, does one probe the possibility that mentality itself is not compulsory? And again, we have Ambedkar's argument on the need for notional change in order for the annihilation of caste to happen. The simple fact that there are different pools of memory that we may draw from to recover conceptual resources that we fear we have lost, and this is part of what Akeel is saying, and what he referred to, the anomaly, an illuminating usher, he calls it, located in the interstices of the background of our traditions and practices, that discloses that there is something there to get right. And the possibility of the anomaly, it strikes me, is a gift of hope. Thank you.
Gosh, we've covered such a wide range of things, tones, modes of intellectual inquiry that I don't know whether I can, well, I can probably sort of speak to my little corner of it. And this, which is sort of today's lecture, which was that Akeel enabled one to think clearly about the emotion implicating domains of humanistic inquiry, right? These now and the challenge of scientism, the imperialism of science, to these domains. And to my mind, humanistic inquiry, when applied to poetry and music, perhaps, is already carrying a whiff of scientism. So I would much rather stay with things like probings, so that there are probings in different media. And the question that Akeel is posing is how one can actually derive any kind of truth claim, some kind of cognitive purchase from in those domains. As basically, since the dominant scientific notion of truth precludes any attribution of truth to these softer disciplines, I hesitate to say disciplines even because they seem very undisciplined to me, frankly. But I will still insist, and I'm afraid it might actually bring me closer to relativism, but I'll try and avoid the word. I want to make a distinction between, as it were, language-embedded probings and non-language embedded probings. That's to say, I'd like to think of sculpture and music also as probings. And probings that can certainly have the potential to make cognitive claims and carry cognitive insights for us. But I frankly, I don't even know how one can begin to talk about truth claims in respect of music, even though one does recognize that there are occasions, there are performances which carry the mark of truth, whether or not we use that word comfortably. So, my particular concern is with how the matter of truth impinges on the language-embedded stuff. Not only because of my own involvement in literature and language, but also because it seems to me, and this I found surprising, Akeel, that the missing term, practically unused, is language. In your two lectures, you do not actually talk about language. And it seems to me that when one is talking about criticism, then language is obviously crucial to it. Basically, it seems to me that the messy stuff of language is central to the experience of transparency that, in Akeel's exposition, to my understanding, indicates the presence of truth. That transparency indicates truth, and obviously opacity also must be deriving from language in some form. Now, apropos this, basically, I'm kind of curious with this foreground, background stuff. That there are affirmations that there are assertions that one affirms transparently. There are others that one seeks to diagnose. One can be in the presence of affirmations, assertions that one seeks not to endorse, but to seek to diagnose. How long have you been feeling this way? That sort of thing. So what is going on? Is it a kind of shared background which enables one to affirm some assertion and seek to diagnose yet another because it is coming from somewhere else? You see, Akeel, this is a problem that arises very much here in a society like ours now, which is so deeply divided. That the other day when I was coming in to the IIC, and we turned into Lodi Road, and my taxi driver, of all people, said, "Ye Lodi Videshi tha na?" So I said, "हाँ, लोधी तो शायद पहला विदेशी रहा होगा, फिर तो यहीं के हो गया." नहीं, ये सब के सब हमारे भारत को लूटा है, and so on. Then I got the whole thing, all right? And I tried. My response obviously was to try and diagnose. I said, basically, where did you find out all this? What are your sources of knowledge, etc. But my point, I suppose, is that communication was impossible. That all my attempts to come to the background understandings which led him to these perceptions were fobbed off. That there was no way that he was willing to expose the background from which those understandings emanate. So, incidentally, apropos the messy stuff of language, Akeel, there's something that I've been wanting to, I've been thinking about, and can't miss the temptation of raising it with you, which is the, to me, fascinatingly different ways in which different kinds of academics cope with the messiness of language. In the sense that, obviously you are a very good example of what philosophers do, which is to use your language very carefully. You define your terms of art. You say this is exactly what my word is going to mean, etc., etc. So that's the philosopher's way of trying to quell the slipperiness of language, because language obviously means many things. It slips away words, say different things. Interestingly, lawyers also seek to tame the messiness of language very differently, as we know, right? They pile on stuff. They pile on stuff in the hope that somehow enough negations, this but not this, not this, not this, etc. Now, these both philosophers and lawyers both seek to tame the messiness of language. My taste, and indeed yours, is for people who actually are able to use the slipperiness, the ambiguity, the multivalence of language. That's poets. Poets actually use ambiguity rather than being embarrassed by ambiguity. They use ambiguity to say what might otherwise be unsayable. So I'm actually fascinated because criticism is what happens at the point, at the intersection between this poetic use of language and critics who seek to make sense of it. You see, I can't merely enthuse about something and say that it carries, sort of a kind of euphoric response is inadequate. Or as I used to tell my students, saying wow or yuck is not good enough. Now, when you try and put some meat onto that wow and that yuck, then again, you are forced to use language and use language in yet another way. All right. So, obviously, people like me, but not only myself, have been people in literary study. When the Oxford English studies were proposed, then it was initially rejected angrily because they said, a university is no place for chatter about Shelley. You want to chatter about Shelley, go and do it somewhere else. Okay, so now this kind of anxiety is something that has bedeviled literary study, at least. Writers are different. Writers veer from, as it were, anxiety to megalomania. So they can be legislators of the future and so on. But certainly literary study has always been racked by this anxiety that they really have no claim on truth, and therefore they long to be scientific in different ways, all the way from I.A. Richards doing, coming in via psychology, or people using computers in order to count words or do something like that, simply because they're embarrassed by the slipperiness of it. So they want something stable, 3.2, 5.7, makes everyone feel much better. So, the alternative to this scientific longing in literary study, which I find unacceptable, very obviously, is the abandonment of any truth claim altogether. So, this whole sort of post-structuralist move in criticism, which, because it cannot achieve scientific truth, will give up the cognitive endeavor altogether. And to me, the challenge really is to try and find or define a space for cognitive endeavor that is not scientistic, but does not abandon the cognitive claim, so that basically it doesn't matter that what we do. Basically, I was thinking, Akeel, that you use the term getting it right, and it's important. I mean, obviously, but I'm wondering what it means to get it wrong. Because we do and certainly need to insist on the idea that there are ways in which one can get it wrong. Okay, so basically, it seems to me, and this might be selling the past as far as you're concerned, I don't know, that since we inhabit language, or language-created world, as indeed we must, even scientists must, inhabit language-created worlds, one can, as it were, reject the imperialism of scientism, that this and this alone, which is, we are exactly on the same page there, which is exactly, that we reject the imperialism of scientism, but then I see no way of getting around the fact that one is talking about, to use the word you use very well, negotiated truths. So one negotiates, creates, works with provisional truths. That one cannot actually get away from this idea that our truths are provisional. To bring it back to language, Akeel, you used Hegel in order to bring in the question of history. But if one approaches these language-based humanistic stuff, via a deeper understanding of language, then history is already present. Language in its detail, in its everyday evolution, already carries the imprint of history. There is no way that one can not recognize that language, evolving language, creates the spaces within which, as it were, differences can be sought to be negotiated, because the meanings of words evolve. Finally, for myself really, I was thinking about, how one can act, because this also seems very airy-fairy, provisional, negotiated, that kind of thing, that a negative confirmation of the cognitive purchase of literature, for me, is actually seen in the phenomenon of censorship. Clearly, the need to censor stuff indicates that it must be carrying some cognitive weight. That this cognitive purchase is curiously paradoxical in that it does not make itself available in the form of falsifiable knowledge. And I'm again fascinated by the fact that a story, something that is manifestly, overtly, flamboyantly fictitious, still cannot be falsified. A story which is declaredly a story still carries cognitive purchase, so that it is sought to be censored, and it cannot. It doesn't go away. A story cannot be falsified. It it resides in a domain beyond the reach of all contradiction. An undesired story, and I was particularly concerned during my work with on George Orwell with the whole Cold War narrative and the power of the Cold War narrative and the poor Soviet state trying to resist it. But it had been constructed so powerfully that all they could try and do was create alternative narratives without great success, as it happens. So, anyway, consent to a counter story, an affirmation of its truth, cannot be forced in a way that consent to Pythagoras can be forced. Well, I suppose I'll also close with Wittgenstein, Akeel, where, his stern interdict, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So philosophers should and must, and, many don't, but literature is a form of devious discourse, which enables one to speak of that which bends our everyday understanding and its grammar. Devious, I insist, because it does not present its reading of our existence in the form of proof and proposition, but instead in the form of, in effect, an argument or a set of arguments, alternative readings that are rendered possible by all the possible plausible by the possible devices of language and rhetoric, of image and assonance, even as it does in guerrilla fashion, always keep open the possibility of evading any single attribution, any singular truth claim, any falsifiable utterance, by taking recourse to alternative arguments, readings, ambiguities, melting into woods that are dark, deep, and dangerous. This is the sense in which, to my mind, literature lives, nobly, honorably, truthfully, lives, that is, to fight another day. Thank you.
All these questions and these comments, some of which had some brilliant points to make. Kalpana, especially, I really find a couple of things you say to be extremely insightful, and I want to focus on some of the things you said about the importance of rhetoric, which ties in with Alok's insistence on saying more about language. You see, one of the things that is so interesting about your point about constitutions and the foregrounded element of the constitutions and all the things in the background that make it possible. I think the point you were making, which is very insightful, I think, can perhaps best be what the relationship is between that foreground and a whole range of rhetorical, poetic, as you say, things. And was very interestingly revealed in the Shaheen Bagh protests. Because here were Muslim women and many others besides whose goal was to bring onto center stage, whose eventual goal was to bring onto center stage constitutional provisions that were being ignored, being ushered out from center stage. But if you look at the rhetoric which they produced, there were all sorts of completely. So there was Kabir, there was this poetry, there was every kind of rhetorical device which was part of our. Well, how to put it? It was part of our shamanic traditions that were everywhere evident in the rhetoric of the activism. And the goal was completely this foregrounded, normative, abstract, constitutional, propositional, digital, as it were. And yet the background was thoroughly analog. And how they combined it, nobody is really, I don't believe anybody, I think it's almost unprecedented. I've never seen anything quite like it. That you had these very abstract goals, you had this completely, the rhetoric that was quite at odds with the nature of the goals, and yet was in promotion of the goals. And I think that really should be studied by people who, it was a moment of which I don't believe was there, and I can't even see anything quite like that in Gandhi's mobilizations, at least, though if anything approximates it, there must have been moments of that kind. So I'm grateful to you for pointing out that the background has that kind of feature which is central to what you're saying. There's something that I think that I want to say. It's a range of different questions. Your question about the habitus, and I think Kalpana's question about bringing things to the foreground. See, what I'm talking about was, if you bring things that are in the background to the foreground, that's a very special kind of move. I think the kind of thing where it was done by Bishop Tutu and Mandela in the transitional justice of the Truth and Reconciliation. Because what they were saying, what happened in the Truth and Reconciliation moment of transitional justice is that Tutu, I think Tutu was the main protagonist there, said, let's not treat this as the foregrounded, I'm putting it in my terms of my distinction, let's not treat this as a foregrounded phenomenon of forensic law, the law which is fully explicit. So what should we do? As you say, fellowship, trust, etc., notions of that kind, which are backgrounded, in part of the cultural commons, as it were, they said, let's bring that into the foreground. This is such a special moment. It was a special moment. It wasn't like ordinary law. These people were, Tutu said, we've got to live with these people, right? And besides, most of the crime was complicit. It wasn't, people just succumbed and didn't protest and so on. So who are we? We can't judge them as we judge somebody sitting silently in the dark as we bring objective evidence against them. Let them speak, and let's trust them to reveal the perpetration of their crimes in confessional moments, and then take our healing forward from that. And I think that is a way of foregrounding, bringing into the foreground precisely the kind of thing. And I think it was a exceptional moment, and I think it's very well worth somebody who's studying the law pursuing the question, well, can we make forensic law less forensic and more engaged? I mean, that's a question that it's not often, I don't know what the possibilities are, but no, we shouldn't stop ourselves from exploring the possibilities that we might seek to make forensic law less disengaged, less, keeping somebody silently in the dark while you produce objective evidence against them. So those are wonderful issues to have raised. But on the question of habitism, see, I think there's one thing you can't foreground. You cannot foreground it. And that is what I think is the deepest thing that gives rise to non-cooperation, to the difficulties that give rise to conflict. There's one thing you can foreground fellowship, you can foreground confessional honesty, and so on. But what you can't foreground is what I think gives rise to all the difficulties, and that's that to do any of these things, to have the fellowship you have, to have the cooperation, you have to be unalienated. If you're alienated, it's going to be difficult to have the requisite fellowship. And I think you can't put that in the foreground. You cannot put in a constitution, be unalienated. What does that mean? It's not an injunction. It's not an instruction. It cannot be even sloganized. You can't even put it like liberty, equality, and fraternity. Fraternity and fellowship can be sloganized. You can't do it with it. What it was is sense to say be unalienated. It's almost as stupid as saying be lucky. So I think and that, I believe, is once you understand that as being what is really part of the cultural commons, there's no escaping what I was calling the last stage of my intellectual thing, which is Marx is saying the real emancipation doesn't come until you remove alienation. Right? So that's what I was calling was removal ideology, removal of the opacities, the transparency of seeing the social truth. Right? And in his case, it was classlessness and so on and so forth. But the point is, it isn't classlessness as some kind of sort of social arrangement for its own sake. It's really there to remove something which is only a background phenomenon and to overcome alienation, etc. And I think that is the question of emancipation and so on that you were seeking, and that's the bottom line. I mean, I didn't say anything about that because we have a whole tradition of Marx. I just ended the story there by saying the illusion and opacity of ideology comes in the way of seeing the transparent truth, which removes the alienation. And so the question of habitus is, see, I don't think Bourdieu the trouble with Bourdieu and Foucault, to some extent, there's Foucault, who's a very powerful figure in books like discipline and punish, and even more, I think, society must be defended. But then that's a very late Foucault, and I didn't have him in mind when I was speaking about these things. And I, in fact, think the very late Foucault goes over onto the other side and virtually is a liberal. But I don't particularly want to get into Foucault. On the question of habitus, the trouble with Bourdieu is that, unlike Hegel, and this is tied to the point about emancipation I was talking about, the trouble with Bourdieu especially is that for him the changes you're talking about, which is most clearly presented on the issues of art in his book Distinction, that's the book where he's talking about how to understand changes, transformations in the culture and habitus. But my point about emancipation, that in the end lands up with the last stage in Marx, in the counter to Rousseau-Hegel-Marx story I was telling, is that for Bourdieu, his idea of overcoming the division between subject and object is that the subject is socially inscribed by the practices in which the subject, and that's the idea of habitus, that the subject-object is overcome because the subject is determined by the practices, and of course the practices change within them. But so the subject-object, but you see, that's not my view. I don't believe that's the view that goes from Kant to Marx through Hegel and Rousseau. My view is there is no overcoming the first person and third person point of view. There's no overcoming the engaged and detached point of view. You can never overcome that. No amount of social determination of subjectivity will overcome that. However much socially determined you are, you experience the world, and as I say, when you get it right, you experience it as it ought to be experienced. So you can't ever get rid of the divide between being an agent and being the object of study. So take two propositions. I intend to do something. I intend that I will do something, and I predict that I will do something. When I intend that I will do something, I'm an agent. When I predict that I'm doing something, I'm seeing myself as an object. I'm seeing myself as I might see an eclipse. Right? I predict that Bilgrami will do this. I've become an object of study. But if I say I intend to do something, I'm in the first person point of view. So no amount of social determination is going to cross this divide. This is an irreducible distinction. So the overcoming of the subject-object divide has to be within the point of view of agency and the first person point of view. Within the point of view of subjectivity, you grasp social reality from the subject point of view. You grasp the social reality, and the transparency brings the subject and object together. So if this is idealism, so be it. This is idealism, but it's not the idealism that Marx was criticizing, right? In fact, if Marxism gets it right, the transparent apprehension of social reality is what the subject achieves. So it's within the subjective point of view. Fine, that kind of idealism is completely compatible. It's not what Marx was criticizing when he was criticizing Hegel's idealism. So, and I think that's the subject-object divide which is overcome, is that notion of transparency. Let me just say something about language. I feel a little hard done by, Alok. My whole point was that we should not see reason in terms that fail to recognize the total looseness of the ways in which we relate to one another. See, language is like the sky above. It's everywhere. There's nothing that it doesn't inform, and it doesn't unsettle, resettle, etc. It's the sky above. And and so there isn't. It's you can't have autonomy without language, because what makes it possible for me to say, here is a want I have, a desire I have. Should I have it? I can't get that distance on my own states of mind unless I can hold it with concepts and language and so on. Right? Otherwise, I'm just immersed in activity. To get out of one's immersion, right? I mean, think of these kids who do gaming, right? They have no idea how to get out of the immersion. The only way you can get out of immersion is to take some aspect of what you're immersed in and hold it up and say, should I be doing this? And that requires language. You can't get that distance unless you have concepts and language. If you can do it in thought, it's only because thought is inseparable from language. So language is there right from the beginning in what I was talking about. And my point throughout was that reason is much more capacious than reasoning. Right? So I think metaphors give you reason. I think analogies give you reasons. That's what I was meant by. So all the slipperiness that you were insisting on was precisely what I was trying to say. That when I persuade you, so suppose somebody persuades somebody of something, the enlightened figure to the Muslim or vice versa and so on. When I persuade somebody of something, I don't direct a piece of reasoning towards them. I mean, I might, but I don't always direct a piece of reasoning at them. I could give a metaphor. I could give an analogy. When I was a callow youth, and I had these communist leanings, and then I sort of got a distance from them. But even when I did, there's nobody I disliked more as a person than the anti-communist. The person I really detested most for a very long time was anti-communist, even when I didn't think of myself as a communist anymore. And one day I realized that there's some anti-communists, really rather smart and intelligent, and how did I change? Maybe I think my wife says I saw some black and white movie where there was, just something happened. And as you say, it might even be by hearing a piece of music. Proust Madeleine, I think that provides you reasons, but it certainly doesn't do it via reasoning. So the whole point I was stressing was that you can change your mind, you can make these transitions of what you take to be getting it right. What you ought to allow is that there are things like analogies, let's say, or metaphors, or images of boats which are like arrows and so on. These things all give you reason to see something, to change your mind. They have no reasoning involved. So one can get people to change their minds without persuasion, but conversion. So the slipperiness that you're talking about gets people to change, not through persuading them, by converting them. It's a defection. Okay, I'm going to stop.